The stampede hit the camp like a wall of thunder given legs, and Vernon Vaughn woke with his hand already on his rifle before his mind had caught up to his body. Cattle spooked. Someone screamed, though the words were nearly lost beneath the drumming of 800 hooves tearing through the darkness. Wyoming Territory in the spring of 1887 had given the bar none outfit a hard winter's worth of snow, and now that snow was melting fast off the peaks above Lost Creek, and something in the night, a rockslide or a cougar or simple cattle madness, had turned the whole gathered herd into a river of horn and muscle bearing straight down on the sleeping camp. Vernon rolled from his blankets and came up running, and the world dissolved into chaos. Canvas tents collapsed under hooves. A picket line of horses tore free and added their own panic to the herds. Men shouted names into the dark, trying to find each other, trying to find anything solid to hold onto in a night that had turned to moving earth. Vernon caught a glimpse of the cook fire scattering like a handful of thrown coins, sparks and embers spinning off into the black, and then a steer nearly the size of a wagon clipped his shoulder and sent him spinning into the creek bed. He came up soaked and gasping, and by the time he'd found his feet the herd had passed, and the camp was gone. Not burned, not truly wrecked, but scattered to the four winds the way water scatters when you throw a stone into a still pond. Supplies flung into the brush, bedrolls trampled to rags, and men, his men, the ones he'd been trusted to bring safe through the worst cattle drive Wyoming Territory had thrown at anyone in a decade, scattered along with everything else. He called out. No answer came but the retreating thunder of the herd and the ragged breathing of his own lungs. 3 miles away, in the timber above Cutter's Pass, Elvira Ellsworth heard the stampede as a distant rolling growl and thought, at first, that it was the mountain letting go again. She had heard 3 avalanches already that spring, each one shaking snow from the high shoulders of the Wind River peaks and sending it crashing down through the gullies in white smoke and thunder. She had learned to tell the difference between the mountain's voice and the voice of trouble on the ground. And this, she realized as the sound did not fade but grew, was trouble on the ground. She had been 3 days out from Sweetwater Crossing with her pack horse and her camera cases, having gone up into the high country to photograph the last of the winter ice on Bridal Falls for a rancher's wife who wanted it for her parlor wall, and she had made her camp for the night in a stand of lodgepole pine that she now realized sat directly in the path of whatever was coming. She did not wait to find out what it was. She had learned in the 2 years since Charlie died that a woman who waited to be certain before she acted was a woman who ended up dead certain instead of merely dead. She grabbed the case that held her negatives, the one thing in this world she could not replace, and she ran for the rocks at the edge of the clearing, and she had just thrown herself behind a granite shoulder taller than she was when the leading edge of the herd exploded out of the darkness and swallowed her camp whole. Her horse screamed. She heard the packs tearing loose, heard glass shattering, heard the whole careful architecture of her livelihood being ground beneath 1,000 hooves, and she pressed herself into the cold stone and held her negative case against her chest and waited for it to be over. It took less than 2 minutes. It felt like an hour. When the silence came back, it came back wrong, too complete, the way a held breath is wrong. Elvira uncurled herself slowly, testing her own legs, her own hands, the case still clutched against her ribs. Her horse was gone. Her camp was gone. The wooden box that held her camera itself, the big view camera with its brass fittings and its bellows of oiled leather, lay somewhere in the churned mud, and when she found it by starlight and touched fingers to the wood, she felt the crack running the length of the case like a wound. She did not cry. She had promised herself, the day she buried Charlie in the hard ground behind the cabin they'd built together, that she would not cry over things that could be mended, only over things that could not, and she did not yet know which kind of thing this was. She sat down in the mud among the ruin of her belongings and waited for morning, because there was nothing else useful a person could do in the dark, and morning, when it came gray and cold over the eastern ridge, showed her a man walking toward her through the trampled clearing with a rifle in one hand and blood dried along one temple. "You hurt?" he asked before anything else, before his name, before any explanation of who he was or where he'd come from. "No," she said, which was not entirely true because her hands were shaking and her ribs ached where she had thrown herself against the rock. "You're bleeding." "Steer clipped me." He lowered the rifle. "Name's Vernon Vaughn. I'm trail boss for the Bar None outfit out of Cheyenne, bringing 4,000 head north to the Sweetwater Range. Something spooked the herd last night and it came through my camp and seems like through yours too. Elvira Ellsworth." She rose, brushing mud from her skirt with a hand that would not quite stop trembling, though her voice stayed steady, because voices, she had found, were easier to command than hands. "I'm a photographer. I was on my way home to Sweetwater Crossing." He looked at the wreckage around her, the smashed camera case, the ruined tent, the single trunk that had somehow survived intact because a fallen log had shielded it. "Home," he repeated. "You live near here?" "I have a homestead on Larkspur Creek, 6 miles west of the crossing. I built it with my husband." She said the words plainly, the way she had trained herself to say them, without the catch that used to live in her throat when she spoke of Charlie. "He passed 2 winters back. I've kept the place since." Something shifted in Vernon's face, not pity. She was watchful enough to see that it was not pity, but a kind of recognition, as though he had met other people who kept things after they'd been told to let them go, and had found himself, in some way she could not yet guess, to be one of them. "I've got men scattered from here to the Sweetwater bottoms," he said. "I ought to find them before I do anything else. But I can't leave a woman alone in the timber with no horse and a broken camera, not with what's loose in this country right now." "What's loose in this country?" He hesitated, and in that hesitation she read more than his words would say. "There's trouble on the road between here and the crossing. I'll tell you as we walk. Can you travel?" "I built a house with my own 2 hands, Mr. Vaughn. I can walk 6 miles. He almost smiled at that, she thought, though it was hard to tell beneath the blood and the dust and the exhaustion that had settled into the lines around his eyes. "All right, Mrs. Ellsworth. Let's see what's left of both our outfits, and then let's get you home." She gathered what she could carry: the cracked camera case wrapped in her one surviving blanket, the trunk left behind with a marker of broken branches so she could find it again. And together they began to search the wreckage of the night, calling out names into the cold spring morning. And that was how it began, not with a rescue exactly, not with either of them saving the other in any clean and simple way, but with 2 people picking through the ruins of a stampede and finding, in the wreckage, the first thread of something neither of them had gone looking for. They found 4 of Vernon's men by mid-morning, bruised and shaken but alive, and a 5th with a broken arm that Elvira set herself, tearing strips from her one blanket for a splint while Vernon held the man steady and watched her hands work with an attention that had nothing to do with the injury. "You've done that before," he said. "Charlie broke his collarbone the 2nd year we were out here. There wasn't a doctor within 30 miles. You learn to mend what you can." She tied off the last strip and sat back on her heels. "Your man will hold until you reach the crossing. Don't let him ride hard." "No, ma'am." He was watching her still, and she felt it, the way she had not felt a man's attention in 2 years, and did not know what to do with the warmth that rose in her at it. So she stood and busied herself gathering the strips of blanket that remained. The road to Sweetwater Crossing, when they finally reached it that afternoon, was not truly a road at all but a rutted track cut through the sagebrush, and it was there, at the crossing of 2 such tracks, that Elvira saw the sign nailed crooked to a fence post, and felt the warmth Vernon's presence had put in her chest turn cold. "Toll 4 passage. 10 cents a head. No exceptions. By order of JCADEFORSYTHE, Deputy Marshal." 10 cents a head, Vernon said low. "For 4,000 head, that's $400 I don't have and won't pay." "Cade Forsyth isn't a deputy marshal," Elvira said. "He was given the title by Sheriff Purnell out of the county seat, and everyone in Sweetwater Crossing knows the title was bought, not earned. Forsyth's men control this road and the pass above it, and nothing moves through this valley that Forsyth doesn't take a cut of. And the sheriff lets that stand. The sheriff is 50 miles away, and Forsyth pays him well to stay there. She looked at the sign, at the crude lettering, at the bullet holes some braver soul had put through it, and someone else had patched with tin. He calls it a toll. Everyone else calls it what it is. Vernon's jaw tightened. I've got 4,000 head of cattle and a contract to deliver them to the Sweetwater Range by the end of the month. I don't have $400, and I don't intend to hand it over even if I did. Then you'll need another way through, Elvira said, or you'll need help from people who know this valley better than the man who's decided he owns it. He looked at her, really looked, in a way that made her feel seen rather than merely observed. Are you offering, Mrs. Ellsworth? I'm offering to get you to the crossing without losing your herd to a man with a bought badge, she said. What you do about the toll after that is your own business. They walked on, and as they walked, Elvira found herself doing something she had not done in 2 years. Talking, really talking, not the polite exchanges of a widow managing her neighbor's careful sympathy, but a real conversation about the valley, about the water rights fight between the small homesteaders and the larger outfits that had been simmering since before Charlie died, about the fences that had gone up in the last year cutting off creek access that used to be shared, about Forsyth's men who had appeared 18 months back like a plague of grasshoppers, thin and hungry and armed, and had never left. Charlie and I filed our claim on Larkspur Creek in the spring of '84, she told him. We built the cabin ourselves, cleared the fields ourselves, dug the well ourselves. When he died of a fever 2 winters back, everyone from the bank in Cheyenne to my own sister in Ohio told me I should sell out and go home. I told them Larkspur Creek was my home, and I intended to finish what we started. She said it without drama, the way she said most things, but Vernon heard the years of arguing that sentence into other people's faces, and something in him, something that had spent a decade riding herd on other men's cattle without ever building anything of his own, ached with a feeling close to envy and closer still to admiration. That took courage, he said. It took stubbornness. I'm not sure those are the same thing. But she was pleased. He could see it in the small lift at the corner of her mouth, and he found himself wanting to make that expression appear again. They reached Sweetwater Crossing as the sun was dropping behind the western ridge, and the town, such as it was, revealed itself as a huddle of a dozen buildings along a single street, a general store, a church with a leaning steeple, a livery, and at the far end, a saloon with more horses tied outside it than any of the honest establishments could claim. Vernon's remaining men had already scattered to find their own scattered horses and cattle, and it was Elvira who led him the last mile to the small house of Doc Reeves, the closest thing the town had to a physician, so the man's broken arm could be properly set. "You'll stay for supper," Doc Reeves's wife informed Elvira in the tone of a woman who would not be argued with, "and your trail boss, too. Can't have him riding back out to that torn-up camp on an empty stomach, not with what happened to poor Sarah Kettleman's boy on the road last month." "What happened to the Kettleman boy?" Vernon asked. The warmth went out of Mrs. Reeves's face. Forsyth's men caught him trying to move a small herd through without paying the toll. Beat him bad enough he couldn't walk for a week. Sheriff Purnell called it a private dispute and wouldn't send anyone out. She busied herself with the stove. The set of her shoulders telling more than her words did about how the town felt, trapped and furious and unable to see a way clear. It was over that supper, with lamplight gold on the table and the broken-armed cowhand sleeping in the spare room, that Elvira learned the whole shape of what Vernon carried, the weight of a delivery contract that would make or break his standing with the Bar Nun's owners, the responsibility for 6 men who trusted him to bring them through safe, and the growing certainty that Cade Forsyth's toll road stood between him and everything he'd been sent north to accomplish. And it was over that same supper that Vernon learned the whole shape of what Elvira carried too. a homestead half a day's ride distant that she worked alone, but for the help of a hired boy who came twice a week. A photography trade she'd built from nothing because a widow needed income, and she had a good eye in Charlie's old camera. And a grief that she had folded so carefully into the corners of her life that a stranger might never see it. Except that Vernon Vaughn was not entirely a stranger by the time the meal ended, and he saw it anyway. In the particular way, she went quiet whenever anyone mentioned how long a woman alone could reasonably be expected to hold a claim. "You don't think I can hold it," she said, catching the shadow of the thought on his face. "I think," Vernon said carefully, "that I have spent 10 years watching men fail at things a great deal easier than what you've already done. I don't doubt you, Mrs. Ellsworth. I was thinking that Forsyth and men like him prey exactly on folks the rest of the world has decided are easy to push. A widow alone, a small outfit with no muscle to back it. I was thinking you're probably on his list if you haven't found that out already." She set down her fork. "I have found that out already. He sent a man to my place last autumn, offered to buy my claim for 1/3 of what it's worth, said it would be a shame if something happened to a woman alone out there with no one to look after her. I told him Charlie's rifle looked after me fine, and he left, but he didn't stop smiling the whole time, and I haven't forgotten it." "No," Vernon said. "I don't imagine you have." They looked at each other across the lamplight, two people who had each been alone in their own particular way for longer than either wanted to admit, and something passed between them that was not yet love, not yet even friendship exactly, but was the beginning of a recognition that would, in time, become both. The days that followed asked a great deal of both of them, and gave, in return, more than either expected. Vernon spent a full week gathering his scattered herd from the draws and coulees where the stampede had driven them, and each evening, having no better place to make camp, he found himself riding the extra distance to the small rise above Larkspur Creek, where Elvira Ellsworth's cabin sat solid and square against the darkening sky, its window glowing gold, its chimney smoking with the particular steadiness of a home that had been built to last. He told himself the first evening that he came only to check that she'd arrived home safe. He told himself the second evening that he came only because Doc Reeves had asked him to bring a bottle of liniment out for her hired boy's twisted ankle. By the third evening, he had stopped telling himself anything at all and simply came, and she had stopped pretending she didn't watch for him on the Ridge Road, and set a second plate at her table without being asked. "You'll spoil your reputation," she told him the fourth evening, setting a bowl of stew in front of him with a small, private smile, "letting a widow feed you every night." "My reputation can survive a bowl of stew," he said. "Can yours? I've survived worse than gossip, Mr. Vaughn. Gossip is cheap in this territory. Everyone's got some to spend, and most of it isn't worth the breath it costs." She sat across from him, and in the lamplight he studied the lines of her face, the sun-browned skin, the steady gray eyes, the strength in the set of her jaw that had nothing brittle in it, only a kind of hard-won patience, and he thought that he had spent 10 years riding herds across half of Wyoming and Montana, and had never once in all that riding felt the particular pull toward a place, a person, that he felt sitting at this rough table in this small cabin on Larkspur Creek. It was on the fifth evening, with the herd finally gathered and rested and ready to move again within the week, that Vernon asked to see her camera. "It's broken," she said. "The case cracked in the stampede. I haven't the money to send to Cheyenne for a new one, and the repair shop in Laramie wants 6 weeks and more than I can spare. May I look at it anyway?" She brought it out from the trunk where she'd wrapped it in flannel, and he turned the brass and mahogany box over in his big hands with a gentleness that surprised her, the same gentleness she'd noticed when he'd held the injured cowhand's arm steady for her splint. "I grew up around wagon wheels and harness leather," he said. "My father made saddles before he took to cattle. I know wood, and I know how to glue a crack so it holds. Won't be pretty, but it might let you work again before Laramie ever sees this box." He worked on it for 2 hours that evening while she developed the last of her salvageable negatives in the small darkroom she'd built off the back of the cabin, a windowless closet lined with black cloth where she processed her plates by red lamplight. And when she emerged, tired and satisfied with the 3 images that had survived, she found him sitting at her table with the camera whole again in his hands, the crack sealed with a hide glue he'd carried in his kit for harness repairs. The joints tightened. The bellows checked and found sound. "It'll hold," he said, offering it to her with a certain shyness that did not match the confident trail boss who commanded 6 men and 4,000 head of cattle. "I can't promise it's as good as new, but it'll take a picture." She took the camera from his hands, and their fingers brushed, and neither of them moved away from the touch as quickly as courtesy might have suggested. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that went beyond the camera itself, and he heard that deeper meaning and was glad of it. "Will you let me sit for one?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. "I've never had my likeness taken, never had cause." "Sit there," she said, already moving to set up the tripod in the last of the evening light through the window, already feeling the old, familiar pleasure of composing a frame, an artist's pleasure that had nothing to do with grief or survival and everything to do with simply seeing a thing clearly. "Hands on your knees. Don't smile. The plate takes too long to hold a smile steady, you'll blur." He sat as instructed, solemn as she asked, but his eyes, when the shutter finally opened and closed, held something that no amount of stillness could hide. And when she developed the plate 2 days later in her red-lit closet, she stood a long moment looking at the image of Vernon Vaughn's face emerging from the chemical bath, at the directness of his gaze, at the honesty in it, and felt her own breath catch in a way she had not expected and was not entirely sure she was ready for. She did not tell him that. Not yet. The 8th day brought Cade Forsyth himself to Larkspur Creek, riding up the track with 3 of his men behind him, and Elvira, working in her garden with dirt on her hands and Charlie's old rifle leaned within reach against the fence post, straightened and watched him come with the particular calm of a woman who had faced this man before, and intended to face him again without flinching. "Mrs. Ellsworth." Forsyth tipped his hat with an oiliness that made the courtesy worse than an insult would have been. He was a lean man, mid-30s, with a face that might once have been handsome before something hard had settled permanently into it, and a badge on his vest that had never been earned by any process an honest court would recognize. "Heard you've had a visitor. Trail boss, they say. Bar none outfit, 4,000 head, aiming to push through my road without paying what's owed." "It's not your road, Mr. Forsyth. Sheriff Purnell's deputized me to keep order on it, which amounts to the same thing for practical purposes." He smiled, and the smile did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "I'd hate for a friend of yours to run into trouble he didn't need to have. Tolls are tolls. Man doesn't pay, there's consequences. I think a woman in your position would understand the value of staying on the right side of consequences. I understand exactly what you are, Mr. Forsyth, and it isn't a deputy of any law I recognize." She kept her voice level, though her hand had drifted, unconsciously, closer to the rifle. "I'll thank you to get off my land." He studied her a long moment, and something calculating moved behind his eyes, the look of a man doing arithmetic with other people's lives. "Your land," he repeated. "Funny thing about land, Mrs. Ellsworth. Claims can lapse. Improvements can burn. Widows alone can find themselves persuaded, given enough incentive, that a fair price today beats no price at all tomorrow." He touched his hat again, unhurried, and turned his horse. "You give some thought to that trail boss's plans if you're inclined to keep being his friend. I'd hate for your homestead to catch some of the trouble that's coming his way." He rode off with his men trailing behind him, and Elvira stood in her garden with her heart hammering, not with fear exactly, though there was fear in it, but with a hot, clean anger that steadied her more than it shook her. She rode to find Vernon that same afternoon and told him everything, and watched his face harden into the particular stillness of a man deciding, in that moment, exactly how far he was willing to go and for whom. He threatened your homestead. He implied it. Forsyth never says a threat plainly enough to be held to it. That's how he stayed ahead of any real law for 18 months. She sat on the overturned water trough outside the corral where his men were resting the herd, watching him pace with the restless energy of a man who wanted an enemy in front of him rather than a shadow that slid away every time it was named. "I won't pay his toll," Vernon said. "Not because I can't scrape the money together somehow, though I can't, but because paying it once means paying it every drive after, and every outfit that comes through this valley pays it too, and Forsyth gets richer and bolder until there's no honest crossing left in the territory. Somebody has to say no, and you intend to be that somebody. I intend to get my herd through without $400 leaving my pocket and without anyone getting shot doing it, mine or his. There's a way through the high pass above Cutter's Notch that avoids his road entirely. It's steeper and it's slower, but it's passable this time of year if the last of the snow's stable." "It isn't," Elvira said immediately. "Not this year. We've had 3 slides already this spring off that exact shoulder of mountain, heavier snowpack than anyone's seen in a decade. I was nearly caught in one myself in February, coming back from a job at the Hendricks Ranch. That pass will kill your herd and half your men before you're through it." Vernon stopped pacing. "You're certain?" "I've lived under that mountain for 3 years. I know its moods better than I know my own temper most days. That pass is a death trap until at least June." She stood, brushing dust from her skirt, and met his eyes squarely. "But I know another way. There's an old wagon road, cut by the first homesteaders before Forsyth's toll road existed, running along the south side of the valley through Peterson's land and Holly's canes. It's rougher, it hasn't been maintained, and it'll add 2 days to your drive, but it bypasses Forsyth's stretch of road entirely, and it won't bury your herd in an avalanche. Will Peterson and Kane allow it? They hate Forsyth worse than anyone in this valley. He's fenced them off their own creek access, twice trying to force them to pay for water they used to get free. I think," she said, and here, for the first time, a real smile broke through, sharp and pleased, "that they'd be glad of the chance to help someone put a thumb in his eye, so long as it doesn't put their own families at risk." Vernon looked at her for a long moment, the woman standing before him dusty and certain and entirely unafraid of a man who had just threatened her home, and felt something settle into place in his chest that he did not yet have a name for, though he suspected, even then, that he would need to find one soon. "Take me to them," he said. The meeting with Peterson and Kane, 2 weathered homesteaders who had each lost land and water rights to Forsyth's creeping tolls over the past year, went better than either Vernon or Elvira had dared hope. Both men agreed readily to open the old wagon road, on the single condition that Vernon's outfit help repair a washed-out section of fence line that had been letting Forsyth's cattle graze onto Kane's hay meadow uncontested, a piece of petty theft that had been rankling Kane for months, and that he'd had no muscle to stop alone. "Fair trade," Vernon said, shaking Kane's hand. "We'll have that fence mended before we move a single head through." It took 3 days, Vernon's men working alongside Kane and 2 of his sons to restring the fence while the herd rested in a hollow meadow out of sight of the main road. And in those 3 days, Elvira found reasons, more reasons than she examined too closely, to be present at the ranch each afternoon, ostensibly to photograph the fence repair for Kane's own records in case he ever needed proof of the boundary before a judge, but in truth because watching Vernon Vaughn work, sleeves rolled to the elbow, sweat darkening his shirt, laughing easily with Kane's boys over some joke she hadn't caught, filled something in her that had been empty a long time. It was on the second evening, walking back from the fence line together while the sunset burned orange and violet over the western ridges, that Vernon finally asked the question that had been sitting behind his teeth for days. "Your husband," he said carefully. "Charlie, what was he like?" She was quiet a moment, and he thought perhaps he'd misjudged the moment, pushed too soon into ground still tender, but when she spoke her voice was steady, only thoughtful. He was patient. More patient than me, which used to make me furious, because I wanted everything done yesterday and he wanted everything done right. He had a laugh that carried across the whole valley. I swear you could hear him laughing from the Hendricks place 2 miles off. He died of a lung fever in the second winter, quick, faster than the doctor thought it would take him, and I sat with him at the end and told him I'd finish the barn we'd started. And I have. And I told him I'd finish the fence line along the north pasture, and I have. And some mornings I still expect to hear him in the kitchen before I remember he isn't there. She glanced sideways at Vernon. I don't say that to make you uncomfortable. I say it because you asked honestly, and I think honesty is owed in return. I'm not uncomfortable, Vernon said. I asked because I wanted to know you, all of you, not just the parts that are easy to see. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. The sunset painted them both gold, and the creek ran quiet beside the road, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, because there was a nearness between them that words would only have complicated. There's a photograph, she said finally, that I took, more than a year ago now. A traveling minister came through the valley, doing weddings and burials for families who'd gone without a proper service for months, and he did a small service for Charlie's grave, a year late but the first chance we'd had, and afterward I set up my camera because I told myself I wanted a record of the marker, a proper photograph to send to Charlie's mother in Ohio. But when I developed the plate that night, it wasn't the marker in the frame the way I'd meant it. It was me. I'd stood too close and caught myself in the edge of the image, reflected somehow in the church window glass behind the grave. And my face, Vernon, my face in that photograph was the truest thing I have ever seen. I looked like exactly what I was, a woman standing at the edge of her own life, not knowing whether to walk forward or simply stand there until the ground swallowed her too. What did you do with it? I kept it. I couldn't bring myself to burn it, and I couldn't bring myself to look at it either, so it stayed wrapped in flannel in the bottom of my trunk for over a year, right beside the camera you fixed. I think I kept it as a kind of proof. Proof that I'd once felt that low, and proof, if I ever needed reminding, of how far I'd have to fall to feel it again. She looked up at him, gray eyes steady in the dying light. I haven't shown it to anyone. I'm not entirely sure why I'm telling you now. Because you trust me, Vernon said simply, the same way I trust you. It doesn't ask permission first, it just arrives. She laughed, a short, surprised sound. That's a fine way to put it. I've had 10 years riding the trail to think about how to put things, he said, and precious few people worth putting them to. Seems a waste not to use the good ones on someone who deserves them. They did not kiss that evening. It was not yet time, and both of them, careful people, patient people, people who had each learned the cost of moving too fast toward a thing that mattered, understood without saying so that whatever was growing between them deserved better than to be rushed into being. But when they parted at her gate that night, his hand closed briefly over hers, and hers did not pull away, and both of them rode away from that gate carrying something new and unsteady and entirely welcome. The herd moved out along the old wagon road 4 days later, and it took the full 2 extra days Elvira had warned of, rough terrain, and a boggy creek crossing that cost them the better part of an afternoon. But it brought Vernon's outfit safely around Forsyth's toll road and clear of the unstable pass, and delivered 4,000 head to the Sweetwater Range exactly on the date his contract required. Word of the maneuver spread through the valley within a week, told and retold with considerable relish by Kane and Peterson, and every small rancher who had ever paid Forsyth's toll through gritted teeth. And Cade Forsyth, hearing that a single trail boss had slipped an entire herd past his checkpoint without paying a dime, did not take the news with anything resembling grace. He rode to Larkspur Creek again 8 days later, alone this time, no men trailing behind him, and found Elvira in her garden once more, and this time there was no oily courtesy in his manner at all. "You helped him," Forsyth said, without preamble, "told him about the wagon road. Turned Kane and Peterson against my collection. Your collection is a fiction, Mr. Forsyth, and everyone in this valley knows it. She did not reach for the rifle this time. She simply stood, dirt on her hands, and looked at him without blinking. I helped a man avoid an avalanche and a false toll both. I'd do it again. You'll regret that. His voice had lost its smoothness entirely now, gone thin and hard with the anger of a man who had built a small kingdom on fear and had just watched a crack open in its foundation. This valley runs the way I say it runs, and a widow with a camera and a cowboy passing through aren't going to change that. You tell your trail boss, when he comes sniffing back around here, that the road stays mine, and anyone who forgets that finds out the hard way. He left without waiting for a response, and Elvira stood in her garden a long time after he'd gone, feeling the particular cold that settles into a person after a threat that means exactly what it says. And it was that evening, riding out to find Vernon at the temporary camp he'd made on the Sweetwater Range while he settled his herd and awaited final payment from the outfit's owners, that she told him what had happened, and watched the last of his patience with Cade Forsyth burn away entirely. "He's not going to stop," Vernon said. "Men like that don't stop when they lose once. They come back harder, especially when they've been made to look foolish in front of everyone who's ever feared them." "I know. I have to go back to Cheyenne," he said, and the words came out heavier than he'd meant them to. "The outfit's owners want my report on the drive in person, and there's the matter of my pay and likely a new contract if I want steady work through the summer. I'd meant to leave within the week regardless of Forsyth. But I don't like leaving you here with that man's threats hanging over your fence line. I've held this place alone for 2 years, Vernon. I'll hold it a while longer." But her voice, when she said his given name for what he realized was the first time, carried a softness that undercut the toughness of her words, and he heard both things at once, the strength and the ache beneath it, and it was that combination more than anything else that had come to define for him exactly what he loved about her. He loved her. He let the thought sit plainly in his mind for the first time, unhurried, unhidden, and found that it did not frighten him the way he might have expected. It settled into him the way good ground settles under a man's boots, solid, trustworthy, something to build on. "I'll write," he said. "And I'll come back before the summer's out, sooner if the outfit sends me this direction again, which they likely will, since the Sweetwater Range needs tending through the season. I don't intend to disappear on you, Elvira." "I didn't think you would." She smiled, though it cost her something. He could see that too. "But I've learned not to count on a man's intentions when there's a whole territory of trouble standing between here and there. Write if you can. Come back if you're able. I'll be here either way, because this is my home and I've no intention of being frightened off it by Cade Forsyth or anyone else. But I'll be glad, Vernon Vaughn, more glad than I quite know how to say, if you do come back." He kissed her then, finally, there in the gold evening light of the Sweetwater Range, gentle and certain, and she kissed him back with a fierceness that surprised them both, 2 years of careful solitude breaking open at once into something neither of them intended to let go of easily. He left 3 days later for Cheyenne, and Elvira Ellsworth returned to Larkspur Creek to finish the barn she had promised Charlie she would finish, and to wait, with the particular patience of a woman who had already survived losing one good man and had decided, with clear eyes and a steady heart, that she was willing to risk loving another. The separation that followed lasted longer than either of them had planned, and it tested both of them in ways the stampede and the toll road never had. Vernon's business in Cheyenne stretched from a promised 2 weeks into 6, the outfit's owners insisting on a full accounting of the drive, then offering him a foreman's position overseeing 3 smaller outfits through the summer roundup, a position that would keep him riding a circuit from the Sweetwater Range down to the Platte and back, valuable work, good pay, the kind of advancement a trail-worn cowboy waited a career for. He wrote to Elvira from every stop along that circuit, letters carried by whatever rider happened to be heading north, sometimes arriving in clusters of 3, sometimes not arriving for a month at a stretch, and each one she read by lamplight at her kitchen table, and each one she answered telling him of the barn's progress, of a photography commission from a Cheyenne newspaper wanting images of the range country for an illustrated feature, of Cade Forsyth's continuing threats. Quieter now but no less present, a fence cut here, a delivery of goods mysteriously delayed there, small cruelties calculated to wear at her resolve without ever rising to a level that any distant sheriff would trouble himself to investigate. Elvira did not sit idle through that summer, waiting on letters like a woman with nothing else to fill her life. She finished the barn in July, raising the last rafters with the help of the hired boy and two of Cain's sons, and stood inside it afterward with her hand against the raw new wood and felt, for the first time in 2 years, the particular satisfaction of a promise fully kept. She built her photography trade steadily, riding out to homesteads and ranches across the valley to capture weddings and family portraits and the occasional grim necessity of a funeral. And in doing so, she became known through Sweetwater Crossing and beyond as a woman of considerable skill and considerable nerve, the photographer who had helped a trail boss outwit Cade Forsyth, a small legend growing quietly around her that she found she did not entirely mind. And she gathered information, carefully, the way a woman does who has learned that knowledge is often the only weapon available to her. She learned, through Doc Reeves's wife and through the quiet network of women across the valley who traded gossip the way men traded cattle, that Cade Forsyth's arrangement with Sheriff Purnell ran deeper than mere bribery, that Purnell received a full quarter of every toll collected in exchange for keeping the county's attention elsewhere, and that Forsyth's men, numbering perhaps a dozen now, were mostly drifters with no real loyalty to him beyond the pay. Men who might scatter quickly if that pay were ever seriously threatened. She learned, too, with a chill she could not entirely shake, that Forsyth had begun asking pointed questions about her homestead's exact boundaries, about whether her claim had been properly filed and recorded, about whether a widow's claim, absent a living husband to defend it, might be challenged in the county land office by anyone with enough money and enough patience to try. It was the kind of legal cruelty that required no violence at all, only paperwork and patience, and it frightened her more than his earlier threats had, because it was a kind of attack she could not answer with a rifle or a rescue, only with vigilance, and, she began to realize, with allies. She wrote to Vernon of all of it, and his letters back grew shorter and more urgent as the summer wore on, promising he would return before the first snow, promising he was saving what pay he could toward whatever legal help her claim might need, promising, in the careful, unpracticed language of a man more comfortable with cattle than with courtship, that she was in his thoughts through every mile of the circuit he rode. It was in September, with the aspens beginning to gold on the high slopes and the first cold breath of autumn moving down off the peaks, that the midpoint reversal came, sudden and violent, and changed the shape of everything that followed. Elvira had ridden into Sweetwater Crossing to collect a shipment of photographic chemicals that had finally arrived from Cheyenne, and it was there, standing at the counter of the general store, that she overheard two of Forsyth's men talking low near the door, careless with drink and carelessly certain that no one in the store was paying them any mind. "Purnell's coming out himself next week," one of them said. "Cade's got him convinced there's cause to challenge that widow's claim on Larkspur Creek, something about the filing being irregular, her husband's name still on the paperwork instead of hers properly transferred. If the sheriff backs the challenge, Cade buys the land at auction for 1/10 of what it's worth, and nobody in the county office asks a single question, because Purnell's the one signing the order. She'll fight it. She can fight all she wants. Ain't a court within 100 miles that'll side against the county sheriff's own order, not without money and lawyers she doesn't have. Cade's waited 18 months to get that creek frontage. He isn't about to let a widow's stubbornness stop him now." Elvira left the store without her chemicals, mounted her horse with hands that shook for the first time in longer than she could remember, and rode for Larkspur Creek with a single, cold clarity settling over her fear. She could not fight this alone. Not the paperwork, not the sheriff, not the slow legal violence of a corrupt system turned deliberately against her. She needed Vernon, yes, but more than that, she needed the whole valley. Every homesteader Forsyth had ever cheated, every rancher he'd ever threatened, standing together in a way that no single sheriff's order could simply erase. She wrote to Vernon that night, a letter with none of the careful patience of her earlier ones, telling him everything, and she sent it by the fastest rider she could hire. And then she began, the next morning, to do the one thing that had always been within her power even when nothing else was. She began to organize. She rode to Kane's ranch first, then to Peterson's, then to 4 smaller homesteads scattered along the valley's southern edge. And at each one she told the same story, laid out the same threat, asked the same question. If Cade Forsyth could manufacture a legal challenge against her claim, he could do the same to any of theirs, whenever it suited him. And the only real defense against a corrupt sheriff was enough honest witnesses, enough documented proof of Forsyth's actual conduct over the past 18 months, that even a bought court would find the fraud too plainly obvious to ignore. "I have photographs," she told them, at a gathering hastily called in Kane's largest barn 11 days later. Homesteaders and small ranchers from across the valley crowded onto hay bales and overturned buckets, lantern light flickering across faces set hard with old grievances finally given somewhere to go. "I photographed the fence Forsyth's men cut on Kane's land last spring, with Kane's own testimony of the date and circumstances written on the back of the plate. I photographed the Kettleman boy's injuries after Forsyth's men beat him for refusing the toll at Doc Reeves's own request before the bruises faded. I have a photograph of the toll sign itself, dated and witnessed. Alone, each of these is a small thing. Together, presented to a judge outside this county, someone who hasn't been bought the way Purnell has, they become a pattern no honest court can wave away. And who's going to carry all this to a judge outside the county?" Old Peterson asked. "Cade's men control the only road out. They control the toll road," Elvira said. "They don't control every path through these mountains, and they don't control every rider who might slip past them if enough of us make enough noise in enough directions, that his men don't know which road to watch." It was a plan built on nerve rather than certainty, and every person in that barn knew it, but 18 months of grievance had built a hunger for exactly this kind of nerve. And by the time the lanterns burned low, Elvira had 11 households committed to the effort, testimonies to be gathered, photographs to be taken, a rider chosen to carry the full evidence to the territorial judge in Laramie. A journey of nearly 90 miles that would need to be made quickly and quietly if it were to succeed at all. Vernon arrived at Larkspur Creek 4 days later, having ridden through 2 nights without proper rest the moment her letter reached him at his camp on the Platte, and found her not frightened and huddled, but standing in Kane's barn with a room full of homesteaders, directing the gathering of evidence with the same steady competence she brought to every difficult thing she'd ever done. And the sight of her, capable and unbroken and entirely in command of a fight that would have crushed most people alone, deepened whatever he already felt for her into something that no longer had any room for doubt. "You didn't wait for me," he said, when he finally caught her alone outside the barn that evening, his relief at seeing her whole and well tangled together with something that was almost, though not quite, hurt pride. "I couldn't wait, Vernon. Purnell's order was coming whether you arrived in time or not. I had to act with what I had." She studied his face in the lantern light spilling from the barn door and softened. "That doesn't mean I'm not glad you're here now. I am, more glad than I can easily say. But I needed you to know, before anything else between us goes any further, that I won't be the kind of woman who sits still and waits to be rescued. Not by you, not by anyone. If that's a difficulty for you, better we know it now." He almost laughed, though the sound that came out was closer to relief than amusement. "Elvira, I have spent my whole life around cattle and men who think strength means never bending. I don't want a woman who waits to be rescued. I want a woman who rides toward the trouble with me and hands me the reins when my judgment's the better one and takes them back when hers is. I think that's what you've just shown this whole valley you already are. I'm not asking you to be anything less than that. I'm only asking to stand beside you while you're it. She kissed him then in the lantern light, with the whole valley's fight gathered around them in that barn. And it was not a kiss of rescue or gratitude, but of two equal people choosing again, deliberately to stand together. And it tasted, she thought, exactly like coming home. Cade Forsyth learned of the gathering within 2 days, exactly as everyone had feared. And his response, when it came hard and fast and left no more room for half measures. He rode to Larkspur Creek on a cold October evening with 11 men behind him, the largest force he had ever assembled in one place, and found the cabin dark and shuttered. Elvira and Vernon and 6 of Vernon's most trusted men from the summer's circuit already gathered inside, having anticipated, through careful watching of Forsyth's movements over the preceding days, that the challenge to Elvira's claim would not remain merely legal for long. Ellsworth. Forsyth's voice carried across the dark yard, rough with an anger that had shed every pretense of legal authority. You've been stirring up trouble across half this valley, sending riders to Laramie behind my back. I've come to settle this the plain way, since the legal way's apparently too slow for your taste. Inside the cabin, Vernon checked the rifle in his hands and looked to Elvira, whose face in the dim lamplight was pale but entirely steady. 11 men, he said quietly. We've got 7, counting you and me both, and this cabin wasn't built to withstand a siege. No, Elvira agreed, but it wasn't built by fools either. Charlie and I set it into that rise for a reason, and I've spent 2 years learning every advantage this ground gives a person who knows it. Forsyth doesn't know this land the way I do. That's the difference that matters tonight. She moved to the back window, the one facing the creek and the dense stand of willow that grew along its bank, and outlined, in quick, low words, the plan that she had already half formed in the days since the meeting at Kane's barn, anticipating exactly this kind of desperate response from a man who had just watched his kingdom start to crumble. The cabin's front approach was open ground, easily covered by rifle fire from the shuttered windows, a fact Forsyth's men would discover quickly and painfully if they charged it directly. But the creek side, screened by willow and by the steep drop of the bank itself, offered a way for 2 of Vernon's men to slip out unseen, circle wide through the dark timber, and reach Kane's ranch within the hour, where the rest of the valley's homesteaders, forewarned by exactly this contingency, waited armed and ready to ride the moment word came that Forsyth had finally shown his true hand in force. If we can hold this cabin for 2 hours, Elvira said, reinforcements arrive and Forsyth finds himself outnumbered instead of the other way around. If we can make him believe in the meantime that we're weaker and more frightened than we are, he may commit his men too fully, too fast, and leave himself with no way to retreat when Kane and Peterson and the others arrive. How do we make him believe that? One of Vernon's men asked. Elvira's answer was to blow out half the cabin's lamps, leaving only a single flickering light in the front window, and to call out into the dark yard herself, her voice pitched with a tremor that Vernon knew, from the steadiness of her hands on the rifle beside him, was entirely performed. Mr. Forsyth, she called, I've got women and children sheltering in this cabin besides myself. I'll not have them harmed for a dispute that's between you and me. Give us until morning to consider your terms, and I'll speak with you plainly at first light. It was a lie. There were no other women or children in the cabin, but it was exactly the kind of lie calculated to make a man like Forsyth hesitate, weighing the risk of being seen, by his own men and by any witness who might later matter, as the sort of man who fired on innocence in the dark. Forsyth's answering silence stretched long enough that Vernon began to hope the ruse might buy them the whole 2 hours needed, but it broke at last with a shout from one of Forsyth's men near the barn, sharper, and more alarmed than any voice raised in mere threat. "Cade! Someone's cut loose the horses." Elvira's breath caught, not with fear but with sudden, fierce satisfaction, because this was no accident and no part of any plan she had made. It was the hired boy, the same boy who helped her twice a week with chores around the homestead, 15 years old and utterly loyal to the woman who had paid him fairly and treated him kindly for 2 years, who had slipped out through the root cellar's second exit, the one that opened into the hillside beyond the corral, precisely because Elvira had told him, days before, exactly what to watch for, and exactly what to do if trouble ever came to Larkspur Creek in force. The scattered horses threw Forsyth's men into exactly the kind of confusion that gave Vernon's 2 chosen riders the cover they needed to slip out along the creek bank unseen. And within the hour, as Forsyth's remaining men struggled to recapture their mounts in the dark, and Forsyth himself grew steadily angrier and more reckless in the front yard, shouting demands that the cabin surrender its supposed cache of women and children. The sound of hooves came thundering up the valley road from the direction of Kane's ranch, a dozen homesteaders and ranch hands armed and furious, having waited only for the signal that Elvira's plan had promised would come. Forsyth's men, drifters with no true loyalty beyond their pay, broke and scattered within minutes of realizing they were now the outnumbered ones, several throwing down their weapons entirely rather than face armed neighbors who had 18 months of grievance behind every leveled rifle. Cade Forsyth himself, caught in the open yard between Vernon's cabin and Kane's arriving riders, made one final, furious attempt to fight his way clear, firing wildly toward the cabin's front window before Vernon, stepping out from the door with a calm that belied the danger, put a single shot through Forsyth's gun hand that ended the confrontation without ending the man's life. "It's over, Forsyth," Vernon said, standing over him in the torchlight as Kane and Peterson and a dozen others surrounded the fallen toll-taker, his men already being disarmed and bound by ranchers who had waited a very long time for exactly this outcome. "Your toll road's finished. Your friend Purnell's finished too, once this valley's testimony reaches Laramie, which it already has, 3 days past, carried by a rider you never once managed to catch." Forsyth, clutching his ruined hand, looked up with the particular hatred of a man watching his entire kingdom collapse in a single night, and found no words worth saying, because there was nothing left to threaten, no leverage left to wield, only the arrival within the week of a territorial marshal sent from Laramie in response to the evidence Elvira's rider had carried there, an evidence too thorough and too well documented for even a friendly judge to dismiss. Cade Forsyth was arrested that same night and taken to await trial in Laramie, along with 2 of his most violent men, while the rest scattered from the valley entirely, their false authority evaporating the moment the toll road's true master was removed from it. Sheriff Purnell, facing his own inquiry once the territorial marshal's report reached the county seat, resigned his office within a month rather than face the trial that 11 households' sworn testimony made all but certain, and the toll road on the Sweetwater Crossing route reopened, free and unguarded, before the first heavy snow of the coming winter closed the high passes entirely. Elvira's claim to Larkspur Creek, the challenge that had started the whole desperate chain of events, was quietly dropped the moment Purnell's office ceased to exist in any form capable of pursuing it, and the county land office, when she rode in herself the following spring to confirm the matter, found her paperwork, properly reviewed at last by an honest clerk, entirely in order and entirely her own. But that resolution, satisfying as it was, came weeks after the siege itself, and in the immediate aftermath, standing in the torchlit yard among neighbors who had ridden to her defense and would, she now understood fully, continue to stand beside her against whatever future trouble the valley might face. Elvira found herself less concerned with Forsyth's fate than with the man standing beside her, Vernon Vaughn, whose hand found hers in the confusion and did not let go. "You're not hurt," she said, needing to hear it confirmed aloud despite having watched him through the whole engagement with her heart in her throat. "No," he said. "Are you?" "No." She looked around at the yard, at Kane already directing the binding of Forsyth's captured men, at Peterson's wife arriving with coffee for the assembled defenders, as though this were simply another neighborly gathering rather than the end of 18 months of fear, and felt something in her chest that had been clenched tight since the moment she'd overheard those two men talking in the general store finally, fully release. "It's done," she said. "Truly done. Not just tonight, but the whole thing, the toll, the threats, all of it." "It's done," Vernon agreed, and drew her against him there in the yard, careless of who watched, and she went willingly, resting her head against his chest and listening to his heart beating steady and strong beneath her ear, and thought that she had not felt this particular kind of safe, this particular kind of home, since long before Charlie died, and that she had not expected to feel it again, and that she was deeply, quietly grateful to have been wrong. The weeks that followed brought their own quieter dramas, the kind that mattered less to the valley at large, but mattered enormously to the two people living through them. Vernon's testimony, along with Elvira's and a dozen others, traveled to Laramie for Cade Forsyth's trial in November, and though Vernon's foreman duties called him away from the valley for the proceedings, he returned each time with news that satisfied even Elvira's careful sense of justice. Forsyth convicted on charges of extortion and assault, sentenced to a term at the territorial prison that would keep him well away from Sweetwater Crossing for years to come. Purnell's resignation accepted, and a new sheriff, an honest one this time, elected by a county that had finally been given proof enough to demand better. With the immediate danger resolved, the two of them found themselves facing a different kind of question, quieter but no less important. What shape their future together ought to take, given that Vernon's work still called him to a summer circuit of cattle drives and Elvira's homestead and photography trade rooted her firmly to Larkspur Creek. "I've been offered a permanent position," Vernon told her one evening in late November, the first snow of the season dusting the ground outside her cabin window, managing the Bar Nun's Northern Range operations, based out of the Sweetwater Valley itself. "It would mean I'm not gone for months at a stretch anymore, not the way I have been. Mostly local work, riding the range here, buying and selling stock at the crossing, maybe 2 or 3 weeks away at the busiest parts of the season instead of half the year." "That sounds like a fine position," she said carefully, sensing there was more to the news than the position itself. "It is." He turned his hat in his hands, an old nervous habit she'd come to find endearing rather than frustrating. "It's fine enough that a man could reasonably ask a woman to build a life around it, if she were willing, and if she didn't mind a husband who still smelled like horse and trail, dust more often than she might prefer." Elvira set down the mending in her lap and looked at him fully. "Vernon Vaughn, are you asking me to marry you, or are you asking me to evaluate your employment prospects?" He laughed, a real laugh, the tension breaking. "I suppose I'm doing both badly at once. Elvira, I love you. I've loved you since I watched you set a broken arm with strips torn from your own blanket and didn't so much as flinch doing it. I don't want a life on the trail without you in it anymore, and I don't want to ask you to give up this homestead you fought so hard to keep, because I know exactly what it cost you to keep it, and I'd never ask you to set that cost aside for my sake. I'm only asking whether there might be room, in the life you've already built here, for me as well." "There's room," she said, her voice thick despite her best effort to keep it steady. "There has been room since about the 3rd evening you rode up that ridge road with an excuse about liniment that we both knew was mostly an excuse to see me. I love you too, Vernon. I didn't expect to, not again, not after Charlie, but I do, and I'm not interested in pretending otherwise for the sake of some notion that a widow ought to grieve forever to prove she loved well the first time." "Charlie would understand that, I think," Vernon said gently. "A man who'd want you happy wouldn't want you alone on principle." "No," she agreed, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, laughing a little at her own tears. "He wouldn't. He'd probably tell me I was a fool to have waited even this long to say yes to a good man standing right in front of me." "Is that a yes, then?" "That's a yes, Vernon Vaughn. Yes." They were married in the small church at Sweetwater Crossing the following February, a modest ceremony attended by nearly the whole valley, Kane and Peterson, and the Kettlemans and Doc Reeves and his wife. All the households who had stood together in Kane's barn and ridden together to Larkspur Creek on the night Forsyth's kingdom finally fell. And Elvira wore a simple blue dress she had sewn herself and carried, instead of flowers, which were impossible to find in Wyoming in February. A small bundle of dried larkspur gathered from the creek bank the previous summer and kept for exactly this purpose. Vernon moved his few belongings to the homestead on Larkspur Creek that spring, and the cabin that Elvira had built with Charlie and finished alone through 2 hard years became, without displacing either the memory or the love that had built it, a home shared fully by 2 people who had each learned, the hard way, exactly how much courage it took to love again after loss, and exactly how much richer a life could be for the risk. It was nearly a year to the day after the stampede that first threw them together, in the same gentle gold light of a Wyoming spring evening, that Elvira finally showed Vernon the photograph she had kept wrapped in flannel at the bottom of her trunk, the one taken at Charlie's grave more than 2 years before, her own grief-struck face caught unexpectedly in the church window's reflection. "I've been thinking about this photograph all year," she said, sitting beside him on the porch step Charlie had built and Vernon had since repaired, the creek running quiet below them, the barn standing solid and finished against the darkening sky. "I think I kept it because I was afraid that face, that exact grief, was the truest version of myself, and that anything happier would somehow be a lie. What do you think now?" "Now I think it was true once, and it doesn't have to be true always." She turned the photograph over in her hand, studying it a long moment, then looked up at him with a small, decided smile. "I want to take another one. Tonight, if the light holds. Same spot on the porch, same camera, nearly the same season. I want a photograph that shows the truth of this year too, not to replace the first one, but to sit beside it, so that whoever looks at both someday understands that grief and joy can both be honestly told by the same woman's face, in the same life, without either one being a lie about the other." Vernon helped her set the tripod in the last of the fading light, and she composed the frame carefully, the barn and the mountains and the creek all gathered into the background exactly as she wanted them. And then she sat beside him on the porch step, her hand folded into his, and told him to hold still, and he did, and the shutter opened and closed on an image that would show, when she developed it that same night in her small, red-lit darkroom. 2 people sitting close together in the gold Wyoming evening, her face turned slightly toward his gaze steady and open and entirely unguarded. A photograph that held nothing of grief in it at all, only the quiet, hard-earned certainty of 2 people who had chosen each other, deliberately, more than once, and intended to keep choosing each other for as long as the mountain stood above Larkspur Creek. She hung both photographs side by side on the cabin wall the following week, the grief-struck woman at the grave and the settled, joyful couple on the porch, and told anyone who asked about them, and several people did, curious about the striking contrast, that both images were true, and that a person's life was better understood as the whole distance between such photographs than as any single frame taken alone. The valley itself settled, in the months that followed, into a peace it had not known in 18 months. The toll road became simply a road again, free for any traveler, and new fences went up not to divide neighbors from water, but to mark honest boundaries agreed upon by honest people. Kane's hay meadow flourished ungrazed by stolen cattle. The Kettleman boy healed fully and rode again without pain. Doc Reeves's wife organized a proper school for the valley's children, funded in part by the sale of Elvira's photographs of the Sweetwater Range country, to a Cheyenne newspaper eager for illustrations of the territory's rugged beauty. Images that included, though she never told the newspaper so, a quiet study of a rebuilt fence line and a wide, hopeful shot of cattle grazing on unfenced range beneath a mountain finally free of any avalanche's threat for the season. Vernon settled into his new position, managing the Bar Nun's northern range with the same steady competence he had brought to every difficult drive of his career, riding out most mornings to check on stock and fences within a day's distance of home, and returning most evenings to the cabin on Larkspur Creek where Elvira waited, not because waiting was expected of her, but because she chose it, the way she chose everything now, with clear eyes and a full heart. They did not speak often of Cade Forsyth, serving out his sentence in the territorial prison far to the south, except on the rare occasions when news of the valley's continued peace reminded them how close it had come to being otherwise. They did not speak often of Charlie either, not because his memory had faded, but because it had settled, finally, into its rightful place, a cherished chapter rather than an open wound, honored by the barn he'd helped begin and the fence lines he'd helped raise, and the woman he'd loved well enough that she'd known, without any doubt at all, that he would have wanted exactly this happiness for her. On the anniversary of their wedding the following February, with a full year of shared life behind them and the mountain snows once again beginning their slow spring melt above the valley, Vernon found Elvira in her darkroom developing a new set of plates, and waited, as he had learned to do, for the particular moment when she emerged into the lamplight with chemical-stained fingers and satisfied eyes. "What did you capture?" he asked. She held up the still-wet plate, careful of the fragile emulsion, and he saw, in the lamplight, an image of the whole valley spread beneath Cutter's Pass, taken from the High Ridge Road at dawn, the Bar Nun's cattle grazing peacefully in the middle distance, Kane's mended fence catching the first light, and in the foreground, unmistakable even in silhouette, two riders sitting their horses side by side, having paused, as they often did on their morning rounds together, simply to look at the land they had both fought to keep safe. "Us," she said simply. "I wanted a photograph of us that wasn't grief and wasn't merely a wedding portrait either, just us, in the ordinary business of a life we chose together. I think it's the truest picture I've ever taken." Vernon looked at the image a long moment, then at his wife standing before him in the lamplight of the home they shared, and found that he agreed entirely, and told her so, and she smiled the particular smile he had come to think of as fully, unguardedly her own. And outside the cabin the Wyoming spring moved steadily towards summer, the mountain snows melting safely now, the creek running full and clear past a homestead that had been fought for twice over in wood. They both knew with the quiet certainty of two capable people who had built their love from repeated brave choices, rather than mere rescue, stand for a very long time to come.